Hi, I'm Fred Satilli, the author of Totsy, FemiNazi, The Straight Story. I wrote this book primarily so that my children would understand what happened to me and consequently what happened to them in their own life. I know they don't know this story. I find that even people who know me for many years don't realize the full extent of the straight story. So I wrote this book not only for them, but for others who might be curious about who I am and how I am where I am at this time. I'm not reading this book on a teleprompter, and I obviously haven't memorized it. So when I read it, I'm going to wear my reading glasses, and I'm going to be looking down at the book, down as I read. For those of you who might think that this is improper and that I should be staring right into the camera at all times, I'm sorry, but this is the way we're doing it. As much as I can look up, this isn't really about seeing my face tell the story. This is something that you can basically listen to. It's an audio book, but it happens to have some video. And there are times when I'll insert pictures or short films or whatever it may be to emphasize or illustrate a point, or maybe might be a document or something that I want to display. So here I go. I'm going to start out with the dedication, and the book, of course, is dedicated to my 7 children. It's a terrible thing to have to deny the truth until your mother dies, but those are her rules. At the time of the writing of this book, I, my mother, my brother, my 4 sisters, have not seen my 7 children for 15 years. The story of Totsy, FemiNazi must be read by anyone who wishes to understand the torment of the author, his ex-wife, sons and daughters, mother and siblings. It exposes the evil that continues to perpetrate that torment and what must be done to remedy the institutions and dysfunctions that flourish with the carnage of his and thousands of similar families. Though I try throughout the book to reach a broad audience that knows a similar story, in my heart, this book is for my children. There are acknowledgments, and I'd like to acknowledge all feminists. Feminists are like judges. There are a few intelligent, well-meaning, productive ones out there, but their efforts are tainted by the fact that they do not make an effort to police their own tribe. The world of feminism, as it is manifested today, is based on lies. The fact that the quote-unquote good feminists for decades did not make an effort to cleanse their own ranks of gender bigots means that they granted consent to those gender bigots' participation. Even the good ones allow the bad ones to roll forward with their ideology of hate and self-service. This self-cleansing, this is an aside now from the book, this self-cleansing is something that we need all throughout society, and I bring it up frequently, and I don't understand why it's not done intuitively, but I guess it's because people really do love crime. Back to the book. Remember, judges and political corruption go back to the beginning of recorded history. A new judge is born into a world whose corruption is well established. This doesn't give any one of them the moral allowance to deny their crimes. I simply acknowledge that the system they should fight is vastly more entrenched than the feminist lobby. Feminism is a recent construct. It is therefore realistic to construe that it was constructed with corruption in its formative plan. Shame on the men and women who did this. Section 1 is getting to know the author. I had an interesting comment about unsubstantiated assertions that I make throughout the book. And this is not a scholarly study. This is not a book of facts. This is not a book of surveys or results or anything like that. In fact, all those things are always questionable in their value. They're always tainted or tilted or slanted or whatever it may be, some self-serving crap. This is a book of me telling the straight story of what happened. And if you don't like it, tough. The story started a long time ago, and chapter 1 is the Free Republic. Here we go. I wasn't born when the story began. The world at that time was ruled by kings, as it always had been. The kings, queens, pharaohs, or even popes seldom abdicated the throne. Virtually all kings were deposed by death. A few died of old age, but most were killed by an oligarchy of men and women who physically killed the existing autocrat and seized power. A new world was discovered in a year that is popularly recognized as 1492. That world was far away, and at the time, England was the supreme superpower of the world. This by virtue of her incredible navy. Most people think of plundering the New World as the Spaniards sacking South America for gold. In reality, world domination was achieved through naval power, which took ships made of wood. By the years of the early 1600s, most of Europe was virtually deforested. Forget the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayans. Gold, schmold. The British took one look at the forests of New England and realized that the unlimited resources of timber there would keep her in world power for as much of the foreseeable future that they could conceive at the time. Wood was the real gold of the New World. England had sources of wealth all around the world, especially in India, and potentially the Far East. The New World was undeveloped as a source of wealth, except for the one thing England needed most, big timber. Boston was a shipbuilding boomtown. The New World had its first real industry, and it was regarded by England as not much more than a source of new ships and taxes. With little resources of its own to resist the world's undisputed superpower, it looked like England would do with the colonies as it pleased. Remember, geographically, the colonies were far away. Many of the colonists were very loyal to England, as they themselves were quite English. Many more were simply farmers, miners, or laborers trying to survive. Then there were the elite, those brave colonial men with education, vision, and courage realized that they could break away from the tyranny of life under a distant king or oligarchy and prosper in a way that men have never prospered before. The founding fathers of America began to find each other, and the Declaration of Independence from Europe and its rule began to take shape. The Revolutionary War that followed was not what many think it was. I find that most people think everybody in America was united in a struggle with England on a personal ideological level. This was not the case. Most Americans were not involved in the effort, as they were busy with survival. There were as many loyalists still loyal to King George of England as there were revolutionaries. England herself was not heartfully committed to controlling the colonies. The king sent mercenaries to deal with what he treated as an annoying police action. America and her trees were simply not his greatest financial concern. In reality, he could simply buy the ships from whoever built them. Remember, at the time, the colonies had no money of their own. Any money that was there was provided by European business concerns. America at that time didn't really offer a good investment in comparison to some of the British king's other international ventures. America's visionary revolutionaries meant business in 1776. They fought for freedom and then proved their resolve again 36 years later in the War of 1812. After America asserted her independence from European rule, the revolutionaries realized that they had to make a contract with the people in the 13 colonial states who fought for it. This contract would be an agreement that the people themselves would rule the land and reap the rewards of their work. There would be no one above them. They could keep it all. This unprecedented deal would be so worthwhile as compared to life anywhere else on earth that everyone would be willing to fight and die for it if they had to. It was that precious. The contract stated that the people had inalienable rights that could never be denied. It then went on to establish safeguards so that a government could not evolve to hold so much power that this contract could be broken. The most fantastic thing about the deal was that even though only a small portion of the population fought for this contract, it was extended to everybody. They called the contract the Constitution. The world at that time was not as it is today. Women did not take leadership roles in government and commerce. They bore and nurtured children, as was culturally necessary since wars were constantly fought and these wars needed soldiers. Producing men for combat was a constant need, so much so that wealthy nations even bought the services of soldiers from other lands. Also, men and women were needed for labor. Slaves, Africa's notorious export crop, were common at that time in Africa, the Middle East, and ultimately the New World's Caribbean areas. It took the Founding Fathers and their descendants 70 years to put an end to that cultural and economic norm. And make no mistake, it was those brave visionary European descended men who ended slavery in America. Considering the speed of communication and transportation at that time and the economic implications, the abolition of slavery was a miracle. But we did it. Equality, demanded by the Constitution, was the law giving sovereignty to the people for the new republic. America was created as a republic, not a democracy. America's failing today is due to the strain from original republican life to a socialistic democratic life, which came about roughly a century later. Republican forms of government are susceptible to an encroachment of democracy. Democracy is cancer to a republic that eventually eats it away from the inside out. In a democracy, eventually, the people destroy their own nation through seizure of the nation's wealth by corrupt officials empowered by its irresponsible masses of voters. This is the flaw of the system that developed from what the educated Founding Fathers had originally conceived. People were given equal rights without equal responsibility. This flaw that was grown to become unmanageable is the very one that is allowing the downfall of America today. America, with its Constitution, had so much appeal to people worldwide that they came from everywhere to live in a world where they could be free from the tyranny of monarchical rule. This freedom to prosper by your own mind and labor was the golden promise of America. This concept of prosper by your mind and labor brought the right kind of people. It brought those who understood and wished to work for success. For the rest of the world, it was almost too good to be true. Oppressed by kings worldwide, people came and dedicated themselves to prosperity attainable through this incredible Constitution. The American Republic was a place where a person could pursue their dream. To be able to say, I am an American, was nothing less than saying, I am my own king. These people, with their hands, their minds, and their ambition, built America into the most prosperous nation the world had ever known. The example of America caused the monarchs of Europe to be disempowered by their people. In many cases, the rulers had to be killed. Russians killed their czar. The French people killed their king. Even the British rulers acknowledged the people's sovereignty and allowed them enough parliamentary representation that the nation's monarchs did not have to be killed, but were allowed to live only as sentimental ceremonial figureheads. Despite the termination of European monarchies, there were still rulers in Europe. Those rulers were banks. The bankers of Europe looked upon America as a giant piggy bank. They needed a plan to break it. America had such a strong national unity that the very idea was all but inconceivable. A military operation was ruled out by the results of the War of 1812. They devised a plan, but the plan would take time. Since the kings were dead or emasculated, The banks were in charge now. Ruling the people would have to be done in a different way, a bank way. The people would have to be ruled by debt. And then here I have a quote from John Adams from 1826, which is, "There are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other is by debt." The complex story of America's early establishment of finance is an incredible story unto itself. A study of the banks from that era would give the uninitiated an interesting insight into why government intervention of bank and financial systems can cause those systems to fail. Let it suffice to say that the young country, even with its disarrayed financial institutions, could pay its debts without income tax on individuals. European banks could lend America money, but America was always well able to pay for the money it borrowed to make its investments. American business was booming. The European banks could make money from investments in American interests, but could not take control of America. Even after America's Civil War, with that conflict's crushing cost in expenditures as well as productivity, America had no unmanageable debt. The financial industry at that time was absurdly complex. That complexity had to be organized somehow. There were power struggles of many kinds for decades. Finally, a misguided leader came forth to stabilize the system by betraying his country to the European banks. Progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson in 1913 established the Federal Reserve. Control of our money was relegated to the European banks. He facilitated control by debt. The European bankers realized that finance alone would not bring them their power. They needed a destructive but popular philosophy that would emasculate the great land on the other side of the Atlantic. It all came together with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. The world was changing rapidly, and change frequently brings confusion, especially to the ignorant and easily manipulated. Where the War of 1812 demonstrated that conquering the U.S. through military attack was a losing proposition, the Civil War showed a way to weaken the great land. Though slavery had an undeniable economic component, the cultural issue was racial divide. The nation was divided by the race issue, something that had never been a problem for kings. With kings, the race of the kings was the race of the nation, and that was all there was to it. Now, with all men being equal, racial bigotry was a problem. In fact, if everybody was equal, gender bigotry was a problem. And lastly, if all men were equal, class bigotry was a major problem. How could men be equal if one man was rich and the other poor? A nation divided cannot stand. The European bankers licked their lips and exploited the philosophers who extolled the virtues of dividing the population by race, class, and gender. Just as individual freedom was born in America, socialism, fascism, and communism were born from philosophers who opposed it in Europe. In the year 1790, 90% of the American population was employed in farming. At the time of the Civil War, it was down to 64%, and by 1900, the population employed in farming was down to 38%. It was the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. There is nothing quite as independent as a family with a farm. A large or even small farm, operated by a strong family with a secure water source such as a well, could sustain that family indefinitely. That same family, if heavily armed with rifles and well trained in the use of them, would be a formidable opponent to any encroachers. The unity of the family, based upon respect for the moral leadership of its elders, would give that family a foundation of trust and certainty. A powerful nuclear family is not something that a power-grabbing government would want to contend with. People are much easier to control when they're massed together in urban zones that are dependent upon government-controlled water, energy, and food supplies. Farm life is a serious commitment. The farm will not run itself. Farm life requires a work ethic that gives a people a strength that fosters self-reliance. The increasingly democratic government wanted a dependent population. Farming was de-glamorized. Not that it ever was a glamorous occupation. There was a dignity to being a farmer. That dignity was denigrated to America's youth. Young people moved from family farms for the easy life of factory jobs in big city. Farming was not left with a labor gap, as millions of unskilled workers were welcomed to immigrate to the vast new world to perform entry-level labor. The difference was that these farm laborers were not family. There was no nuclear loyalty, hence no power for the farmer or his farm. The influx of labor meant that labor rates were cheap. Cheap labor was arriving every day by the boatload. When you have people arriving in a new land, and those people have no power base, they create one. Tribal castes of all kind grew out of urban ghettos, in factories and mines, and on farms. Soon enough, these people banded together and were recognized for their value and potential power. Without the workers, the American industrial machine would grind to a halt. Labor unions were born. The European bankers, still wanting to control America's wealth, realized the value of discontent in America's masses of workers. Money poured in to swell that tide of class warfare. It was all coming together nicely for the people who wanted to rule the world. The communist philosophy of disempowering the world's people with division based upon race, class, and gender, and then controlling them with the servitude of debt, was being executed like clockwork. In Europe, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was leading the way in the control of its own people with the bold installation of the first Communist Party government. America had its race and class issues, and the progressive Democrat President Woodrow Wilson betrayed the country financially with his promotion of the Federal Reserve. All that was left was to divide the country on the issue of gender, and the foundation of communism in America would be complete. In 1913, or thereabout, the women's suffrage movement was rolled into high gear. When America was founded, voting rights were different from state to state. New Jersey and Massachusetts had women voting from the start, but in 1807, women and people of color had to be disallowed from voting to prevent the epidemic of voter fraud. I would love to make a sarcastic remark how we've stamped out voter fraud and election fraud here in the 21st century, but alas. In any case, women did need to have their right to vote reinstated, and in 1920 there was a vote for a constitutional amendment. Ayes included 36, 82% Republicans, and 54% Democrats. The nays comprised 18% Republicans, and 48% Democrats. It was ratified by sufficient states for the 19th Amendment of the Constitution to be passed, which prohibited state and federal gender-based restrictions on voting. This was a great moment in America's mandate for equality. Who could ever have guessed that this social leap forward was done merely to make women a tool for political corruption? Just as rich white Republican men had freed the slaves, rich white Republican men had given women the right to vote. Thank you. I think the message of that chapter is blatantly clear. I'll close for now and resume soon with chapter 2.